Hello everybody, good evening and welcome to AHDB Horticulture's webinar looking at operating in a reduced labour environment. This is obviously one of the biggest topics facing everybody right now. I mean, it's been a massive topic for the last couple of years, of course compounded by the problems of Brexit, and then as if all that's not enough, we're now trying to deal with this situation in the coronavirus crisis. So very good evening to you. I hope you're all keeping well and your businesses are keeping afloat and coping as well as possibly can, given the extraordinary circumstances that we find ourselves in. I will do our introductions in just a moment, but before I do, a few moments of housekeeping. All the attendees are currently muted for obvious reasons, but you do have the opportunity to put your questions to all of our panelists tonight. If you have a look on the right-hand side of your screen, there is a question box, so please do type in any points or questions that you would like to make. We'll attempt to feed some of them in during the course of the discussion, and then at the end we'll have a good 10-15 minutes to get through as many as we possibly can and try to discuss all of the points that you'd like to raise this evening. We've got approximately 1 hour for tonight's webinar, and we'll be finishing around 8 p.m. And if you have either come and joined us quite late, or if you'd like to review any of the points or any of the notes that were made during the session, the recording will be made available to you after the event and emailed to your email address. So don't worry too much about taking notes. Now, let me introduce tonight's panelists for you. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Michael Barker. I've been a horticultural trade journalist for the last 15 or 17 years, in fact. I was most recently editor of the Fresh Produce Journal until December. I've been there for 10 years. Before that, I was Fresh Foods editor at the Grocer magazine, and I've also worked on 2 other horticultural publications where I covered meat, fish, fruit and veg, and also ornamental horticulture. So I've been writing about the sector for a long time, and I'm very proud to say that I've joined the AHDB Horticulture Sector Board as an independent member in April, hence my appearance here tonight. And I'm really looking forward to having the opportunity to making a positive contribution to the industry's future over the next couple of years. Now, to introduce the first of our 3 panelists today, I'm going to hand over to Lee Abbey from the NFU to introduce himself. Lee.
Hi, yes, so I'm the Chief Horticulture Advisor at the NFU. Been at the NFU 14 years, and I work alongside a small team, but also our elected board of horticulture members, of which there are 12, and they cover the whole span of the horticulture sector, from ornamentals through top fruit, soft fruit, etc., and also potatoes. And we work together in order to identify the policy priorities for the industry and to lobby on our members' behalf. Of course, right now, our focus is predominantly based on the impacts from the coronavirus.
Thanks very much, Lee. Some absolutely fantastic work going on there at the NFU. And we also have, I'm delighted to say, from the British Growers Association, Jack Ward. Good evening, Jack. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Hello, Michael. Yeah, my name is Jack Ward. I'm the Chief Executive of the British Growers Association. For those of you that are not familiar with British Growers, we are an association of associations. So we have about 26 different organisations in our membership, and they comprise crop associations. We've got quite a lot of producer organisations. We've got a couple of marketing organisations, and we have a membership organisation. And British Growers largely exists to provide the administration services which support all those organisations. And we also do some advocacy on behalf of the fresh produce industry as well. So I have been at British Growers just over 6 years, almost to the day, but I've been involved with the industry for about 39 years now.
Fabulous. And completing our lineup tonight from the AHDB, Gracie Emeny. Good evening, Gracie. Can you hear me, Gracie? Well, I can't hear Gracie.
Hello.
Just a moment.
Sorry,
oh, there you are. Good stuff. Sorry, Gracie. Tell us about yourself.
Sorry, yeah, I'm Gracie Emily. I'm a Senior Knowledge Exchange Manager at AHDB Horticulture. For the last couple of years, I've predominantly been working on the AHDB Smart Hort project, which has been looking at challenges that labour shortages have posed. So it links in quite nicely with being able to provide some resources in light of the current challenges.
Brilliant stuff. Thanks very much, Gracie. And you'll get the opportunity to put your questions to all of our panel as the evening progresses. So we're going to start by having a look at the current situation. It's obviously been impossible to miss the news coverage of the impending crisis across the horticulture sector in particular. While our borders are still open, some of the key countries that provide our labour, like Romania and Bulgaria, have shut theirs. This has made access to the labour pool increasingly competitive. But there are a few shards of light at the end of the tunnel. We understand that quite a lot of the seasonal labourers are already in the country, and perhaps there's an additional opportunity, albeit from a sad situation, with extra staff, British staff, who've either lost their jobs or are currently being furloughed. So, Lee, I'm going to start with you. How do you gauge the current situation and the season ahead in terms of labour?
There are lots of different possibilities and angles to this, so I'm going to try and keep this as brief as I can. But if we look at, we usually recruit 99% of our seasonal labour from the EU. Now, we don't have exact data to know how many of those are resident in the UK versus those that come in and out, but the estimate is that the vast majority do come in to the country and go home again. Now, of course, this year there are travel restrictions, understandably, and therefore limitations on getting EU workers over. And of course, what's really important about the EU workers that we get is a large proportion of them, around about 50%, are returnee workers, people that have been on farm year after year and have built up a good level of skill and experience. Now, with the restrictions, of course, there's then the UK workers who, as you mentioned, furloughed workers, those that are already unemployed, perhaps students that are no longer studying. There's an opportunity, of course, therefore, for them to help fill the shortfall that we have in our workforce. But then there's lots of challenges around that as well, because a lot of people can't necessarily commit to the number of weeks required, or maybe the number of hours per week. And of course, if they're furloughed, then as restrictions are lifted eventually, then they will return to their day job and we will be left short again. On top of that, we've got the seasonal worker pilot scheme, and the pilot scheme, which was expanded thanks to NFU and industry lobbying to 10,000 for this year. Well, that's effectively on hold right now because the countries recruiting, where we're recruiting from for that pilot scheme, all of the visa offices are shut. And unlike our EU recruitment, where of course it's freedom of movement currently, those countries are not within the EU, therefore they do need visas, and without those visas they can't travel. So there's issues there as well. Wrapping all that together, there's a massive issue around costs, because the additional recruitment activities that businesses are having to make, because a lot of businesses have already recruited for this year, but they can't get their workers, so they're recruiting again, plus all the measures they have to put in place for social distancing. If you have a reasonably large UK workforce, a good proportion of those will probably travel in and out. And therefore there's costs for example, building a new car park, which you never anticipated needing. So there's an awful lot of issues around this, and this sort of outcome will depend on how the phased exit happens, as to how much or how soon some of these impacts could really bite. But today, as it stands, recruitment activities are going reasonably well. There is a small level of shortage identified by the NFU of around about 10%. But of course, it depends on furloughing, it depends on visa restrictions as to whether we end up with a real pinch point at the peak of the season, sort of back end of May into June.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of different aspects there, and we're going to dig into quite a few of them separately in the minutes ahead. Jack, you obviously talk to a lot of growers in your role. What are you perceiving is the attitude? Because we see a lot of things in the press about how dire things are, and a lot of predictions about shortages and so on. Is that the kind of mood you're getting, or is it not quite as serious as that?
Well, I think we're in a constantly changing situation. I think it's just worth reflecting that finding the 70,000 or so seasonal workers that we need has been an increasing challenge for the past few years, even recruiting out of Eastern Europe. And I suppose, looking at the practicalities of this, we were on course to recruit, as Lee has said, a significant proportion of the total workforce from Eastern Europe. And then middle of March, it became evident that that sort of supply of labour was going to be certainly cut off in the short term, and we don't know how long that supply will be cut off. Effectively, the industry's had to do a 180-degree U-turn, abandon quite a lot of its plans to recruit from Eastern Europe, and then try and find sufficient labour from the UK. And there has been a terrific response. There's been a lot of interest, but I think there's quite a long way to go between turning that interest into well-qualified seasonal workers, because as Lee has said, I think growers are looking for a certain amount of commitment through the season. There are certain sort of physical aspects concerned with seasonal work, and so bringing this all into the mix is quite difficult sitting here today to know exactly what the situation will be when we hit the peak of the season, which will start around June.
Yeah. Okay, at this point, what we'd like to do is get a feel for how the attendees to this webinar feel that their seasonal worker requirements are being met. So we've got a poll here that's going to come up on your screen. You're going to get the opportunity to pick as many different options as you like. So I'll read them out, and if you cast your votes while I'm reading the options. The questions are: what are the challenges? And the options: I'm okay now, but concerned I won't have enough labour at peak. I need labour now to look after or pick my crops effectively. My productivity is going to be impacted by social distancing. Social distancing is in place, but staff aren't following it. Or sales have been affected and I'm worried about the future. So those are your options. Pick as many as you like, or none if everything's going serenely for you. And we'll give you the results in just a moment. Hopefully you've had a chance to look through that and cast your votes. I'm seeing some quite interesting figures here. Everybody is concerned that they're not going to have enough labour. Should we close the poll? I think we've had enough time. Well, let's give it another couple of minutes, in fact, another couple of moments. As it stands, absolutely everybody who's voted has said that they're okay now, but concerned they won't have enough labour at peak. That's a very interesting result. That suggests that we're not in the crisis yet, but that everybody's worried about what is coming later down the road, which makes it all the more important that we're taking part in these sort of webinars and planning for the future. 45% of you have said that your productivity is going to be impacted by social distancing. I suppose that's absolutely inevitable, but I'm hearing some quite innovative examples of how growers are managing the social distancing situation. 36% of people have said that their sales have been affected and that they're worried about the future. I'm almost relieved to hear that figure is relatively low. I mean, that's still obviously a third of people whose sales have been affected, and that's 36% too many, but that's also quite encouraging that 2/3 of you haven't reported that. 27% say social distance is in place, but staff aren't following it. Hopefully we've got a bit of advice on that later on. And 9% only said that they need labour right now to pick their crops, which suggests that most of the labour requirements are currently being met. Lee, any immediate thoughts on those poll results?
So yeah, not massively surprising in the sense, okay now, but concerned we won't have them in the peak, because that's what we're hearing across the industry. Of course, we're not in the peak, so the numbers are relatively low now anyway. But of the requirements, people are managing to get either they got people in before the lockdown, so the EU workers, and some EU workers have continued to come in since that point, or a combination of some of the UK recruitment that's begun. So yeah, the critical point is, of course, when those big numbers really hit back end of May onwards, is whether the UK workers are still here working on farm, and or whether there are further restrictions getting people from the EU. So yeah, it's useful to see that to sort of clarify things we're already hearing.
Yeah, definitely. And let's move on to one of the things one of the big talking points, which is Brits working on farms, something that of course has pretty much not happened for a very long time in this country. And I'm pleased to say that AHDB, working together with DEFRA, the NFU and BGA, have come up with this support for the industry under the banner of the Pick for Britain initiative. This is a website that's been put together to allow the public to look for jobs while they've either been furloughed or they've lost it. I'd like to come to Jack first on this, Jack, and can you explain a little bit about the reasoning for why this has been created at this time?
Yeah, I think we felt across the organisations that were involved with this project that we needed a central point that we could direct people to. I think British Growers, in common with many other organisations, at the start of the crisis were inundated with those offers of help from recruiters who were coming from outside the industry, who got all sorts of imaginative schemes set up to transfer people from industries that have been heavily affected by COVID-19, and could we just put them in touch with employers? And I think we just felt that there needed to be a central point. In fact, I think we followed an example set by British Summer Fruits, who set up their own Pick for Britain initiative aimed specifically at the berry industry. And I think we felt that there needed to be something for the broader industry that covered brassicas, that covered asparagus, that covered other crops, salad crops, which weren't part of the berry industry. And this has been a coming together of organisations to try and give this central point that we can point people to if they're interested in a job, a seasonal job on a farm.
Absolutely, and it's a really great initiative, and it's good that it's been put together so quickly. Lee, can you talk us through some of the key elements of what is featured on this new hub?
Sure. Just one thing to make clear right from the very beginning, the Pick for Britain is not a job site in the sense that it doesn't list individual jobs. What it does, it signposts to recruiters. So if there is a labour provider or a farm business that is recruiting at this present time, they're able to be listed on the site and the general public can go on and find them. But the sorts of things that are on there, like I say, the list of recruiters, that's critical. The recruitment activities continue to be and need to be managed by the recruiters themselves. So this acts as the hub to enable to signpost the general public to those recruiters. It includes on there, importantly, an FAQ, frequently asked question list. And the intention of that is for that any worker who's never worked on farm before, which is probably the vast majority of the people that look at the site, it gives them an indication of what type of roles there are, how long they might be for, what the living arrangements are, how people are managing social distancing, all that sort of stuff. Because it's really important that people go to a recruiter with their eyes wide open. And we've had instances where people have gone to a recruiter and perhaps they've said, you know, I've seen this in the news, I'd like to help out, I can do 2 hours on a Tuesday morning and half a day on a Friday. And obviously those things are really difficult for recruiters and businesses to manage. So there's an FAQ in there to hopefully enable people to understand what they're getting into before they make that direct approach. There is also some information on there linking to government advice about working on farm, about social distancing on farm. There is information about furloughed workers. So if someone is furloughed, it helps them understand what they can or can't do in terms of getting another job. And there's also information on there about GLAA licensing, because of course, if you, I don't know, let's say if you're a farm business with workers that haven't got work because your market's gone down, what do you need to do to be able to share those workers with another business, for example? So there's information on there. Yeah. And there was another piece. Oh, so if you want to be listed on the site, then there is a form in there where you fill in your details, and then a select group of individuals, sort of led by DEFRA, then sort of just review those and determine which ones can be listed or not. And what's critical about being listed is that you're either a GLAA licensed labour provider, or you are a farm business with a website which you can direct direct workers to. They're the sort of key critical pieces in order to be listed on the site.
Fabulous. And I mean, I'm sure there's listeners out here who are suggesting that a website is all well and good having all this information, but is it really going to benefit them? Why would you urge Jack growers to give this a chance and to have a go at using the website and the resources in there?
Well, I think it's one of a number of tools, Michael, that's available to growers. And actually, we have regular fortnightly catch-ups with all our crop associations. And the feedback I'm getting is that people are using a range of different methods to attract people. And what's been quite interesting is that quite a lot of them are reporting that they have a lot of local interest. People obviously know that the business is there in the village and have been approaching them direct. And obviously there are agencies out there that are busy recruiting, and there's this Pick for Britain initiative. So I think, you know, from what I'm picking up, that most growers are using a range of different mediums in order to attract people to these jobs.
Yeah, definitely.
Michael, can I add in something on that, please? Just for anyone who may be interested in promoting their roles through Pick for Britain, it was formally launched only a matter of days ago, I think roughly 10 days ago. And in the last 10 days, the site has had over 80,000 unique visitors. And just in the last 24 hours alone, there's been over 10,000 unique visitors. So it is something that the general public have picked up on and are seeking out. So it is a genuine opportunity for you to list the fact that you are recruiting and sort of get the general public connected with you. If you're not recruiting, of course, then it's important to make sure you're only listed on the site at the point where you do want people to contact you, because obviously you don't want to be inundated at the point where you're not recruiting. But the site is so far proving to be successful with the general public.
Yeah, and I think above all, what is really useful is just having this centralized hub. I know, for example, that the Fresh Produce Journal, when they've written stories recently about the opportunity for staff to for furloughed staff to go and work on fruit farms, there's been a lot of people either contacting the journalists directly or writing in the comments below the story, oh, please do tell us, how do we go about this, etc., etc. And just having that centralized resource with more information that we can direct the public to and get standardized information is so useful, I think, in this time. But of course, it's not just from the general public that we are looking to recruit staff, and AHDB has actually been spending quite a significant time updating and producing relevant content for the Pick for Britain website and ensure that people have access to the advice for recruitment, induction and so on. But I'd like to bring in Gracie here. Gracie, can you give us some advice on how to introduce labour from other sectors, such as hospitality and catering, into horticulture, and how we can use the website to advertise the benefits of working to harvest crops?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So we're obviously in uncharted territory at the moment, and whilst there are hurdles that no doubt need to be overcome, we do also have a really valuable opportunity to recruit workers from other sectors, as you said, such as hospitality, catering, and the summer events world, people who would normally be working at festivals. So while in many cases these individuals are likely to have limited prior experience in horticulture and more general farm work, they're also going to have a lot to offer. They're used to doing jobs that are often physically demanding, antisocial hours, and quite often in challenging conditions as well, specifically kind of the events world. So I think the key thing that we've thought about first is how to attract these people to come and work for horticulture and to get them to realise the benefits and the opportunities that are there for them. So one thing that we've suggested and that we've seemed quite popular when we've spoken to growers about it is the idea about producing a really informal short video introducing yourself, your business, what crops you grow, what sort of work's involved, and think about promoting that in like local social media like Facebook groups, community groups, and really promoting the benefits of people wanting to come and work within horticulture, the benefits of working, you know, to produce food for the supply chain. There's so many benefits out there that I think we've got the real opportunity to sell in these more informal kind of personal updates. I think getting people understanding more about what's involved and then potentially linking them either to your own employment site, to business, or to Pick for Britain, I think it's a good way to make sure that people have that kind of that level of information, that they know what's expected of them, and it lets them to make an informed decision about whether it's for them.
Definitely. Thank you, Gracie. There's a comment here from Luke Hibbard. He points out that currently Pick for Britain does not come up on the first page of Google. So that's really just a point, I guess, for us all to take away and to feed into whoever's built the site. I believe that there are ways that you can, I don't know, pay to appear on the first page of Google. So thanks for that, Luke. We'll make a note of that point for the ongoing development of the site. Continuing with you, Gracie, there's quite a likelihood of people with no prior horticultural experience of having worked on British farms this year. It's not really a situation that we've come across in these sort of numbers before. And that obviously means that the provision of high quality training has never been more important. Now, I know that AHDB's developed numerous health and safety and food safety resources to help with this, and are working with businesses to consider how traditional training resources can be made more digitally accessible. I'd just like to ask you to expand on this a bit more and perhaps recommend some ways in which businesses can ensure that they have got the right training in place for new starters when they arrive.
Yeah, of course. So one of the areas of work that we've been doing a lot on is helping to make sure that everyone has a really thorough induction process, and to make sure that we are covering all of the training requirements for that business, to make sure that everyone is up to speed with what's required of them before they start at that business. So what we've pulled together through the kind of coronavirus pages is we've got a page focusing on induction, where we provide a simple induction checklist, which you can literally just work your way through and just make sure that everything's covered off, and we're signposting to all of the training resources that AHDB have produced over the last few years, which are even more relevant than ever at the moment. So yeah, we've got health and safety training DVDs, we've got generic health and safety ones, but we've also got sector specific ones for soft fruit and for protected edibles. We've got guidance, sorry, those videos, just to say as well that they're also translated, so we've got them in a variety of different languages as well. All are available on the AHDB Horticulture YouTube channel, but we do have, through these resources that we've provided, we've kind of pulled all of these training videos together so that they're all easy to find and in one place. We're signposting to food safety content that we've developed through previous projects, and linking to some older AHDB videos. A lot of the content is still very relevant and really stresses the importance of food safety to new starters. We've also got training guidance on there, which is more maybe at a crop specific level. So we've got the guidance on there about the champion soft fruit picker, for example, which I'm sure lots of people in the soft fruit industry are already aware of, talking through how we can get workers and or just provide guidance on how to specifically do tasks, and again really enforces the importance of health and safety. We've got some videos on there as well, again slightly older but still relevant, to some apple harvesting and outdoor flower harvesting, but what we've done is we've pulled them all together into one page to signpost and to provide more information about them, just so that we've tried to keep it as easy as possible for everyone to find what they need for new starters. Certainly something that's been suggested for like sending the health and safety, the link to watch that before people start with you on site, and just someone's told me that they've produced their own little multiple choice quiz to make sure that when people have started that they've understood everything, and you feel comfortable that they've got that basic level of training behind them.
fabulous, thank you. And we certainly don't want anyone doing what the bloke in the right-hand picture on this slide is doing. I fear for his leg, sticking it in that machine like that. A comment here from Beverly Dixon, the Group HR Director at G's. She says, investment in personal engagement during recruitment and additional welfare training support is proving to be worthwhile. Absolutely, that sounds extremely valuable as well. Thank you, Beverly. And please do send your comments or questions to us. We'll try to read them out as we go, or if not, we'll come to them at the end. So don't forget to do that as we move along. Now, we're all getting used to the phrase social distancing, which is something that I don't think was anything any of us ever thought too much about previously. We were incorporating it in our home and family lives, but businesses are also having to think quickly about the way that they normally operate. That's particularly complicated in food environments such as pack houses, processing factories, and so on. So I'd like to ask each of our experts really what advice they would give to businesses who are trying to implement social distancing measures, and whether they've got any examples of good practice that they've seen among growers. And please, if you're in the audience and you've incorporated some social distancing measures in your business that you'd like to share, please do drop them in the comments and we'll read them out. Lee, perhaps I could start with you. Have you got some examples of what you're seeing at growers?
Yeah, I'll give some brief examples, but I need to make a key point on this. But for example, lots of people have been trying to work on how they can minimize groups of people being together. So that could be splitting shifts so that there's fewer people on the shift at any one time, putting partitions in pack houses. When people live together on farm, then sort of managing those group so that they work together at the same time. Therefore, people aren't mixing quite so much. More frequent hand washing, using personal protective equipment wherever possible. So all these sorts of measures are being adopted. I just wanted to say that on this particular point, what's critically important is that people follow and that there is suitable Public Health England guidance, because of course ourselves at the NFU or AHDB, you know, we're not the experts in this particular area. And what the government had put some advice out about working on farm, but it was pretty generic, and it still sort of referred to keeping 2 meters apart and didn't quite reflect some of the realities on farm. So we, alongside some other industry stakeholders, have worked with DEFRA recently to develop a guide for working on farm, which is geared towards seasonal workers, but basically it's more broad than that. It's about groups of workers on farm, and it was published last week. Importantly, it is Public Health England endorsed, this guide, although it's been hosted on the AHDB website. So that's that first image on the left on the screen, as we can see at the moment. And I would absolutely encourage everyone to look through that advice, because it contains information about what the government have advised, i.e. the stuff you must do, but it also contains a range of different measures that you could implement where practically possible on farm. But it also, very importantly, recognises that it's not always possible to completely separate your workforce in every instance, and therefore advice on how you can minimise risks in those cases. And that includes instances such as when they're travelling to and from site, perhaps in a minibus. We know some local authorities were questioning the use of buses a few weeks ago. I think that's probably died down a little bit now anyway, but it's important to follow best practice wherever possible. And just one very last thing, sorry to hog it, is that obviously all of these measures, however, again, adds to the cost of managing things on farm. And we are looking to try and capture as many of these costs as possible to just continue to build an evidence base when we as an NFU are lobbying for greater support from the government. It's important to have as much evidence as possible. So in terms of best practice, I would look at the guide. But actually, you know, if these costs are sort of rocketing, I would share that information with us, because we can help capture that and share it with government.
Absolutely.
If I can just jump in quickly at that point as well, and just build on what Lee said about the guidance being endorsed by Public Health England. Just to point out that the guidance here is only relevant within England, and we are aware that the guidance is differing slightly in different devolved regions, so it's different in Scotland and Wales, but we are working with colleagues in both areas to kind of work to be able to produce similar guidance to make available as well. So I just wanted to stress that point.
Absolutely, and it seems like a good moment, Gracie, to flag up a recent podcast that I believe that the AHDB's put out. Is that something you can tell us about?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, if you go to the AHDB website and look at the podcast area, it was released last Thursday, and it was a discussion with myself and a couple of growers where we were talking about practical things that they had changed and adopted as a result of social distancing. So we had examples of different kind of the way things were transported around businesses differing, and how communication in particular had to change, and in some cases like definitely finding positive results as a result of that. So I would encourage you to listen to some just some honest conversation between growers about the sort of challenges that they'd faced and what they'd done to overcome it.
Definitely, and I know for some conversations that I've had with growers that we've seen a whole range of things being put in place, from signposts very visible on arrival at the site that there's going to be social distancing, as much as anything just to reassure staff. We're seeing perspex screens put up, lines being written down on the pack house floors to ensure that people are kept 2 meters apart. We're seeing things like workers being split into smaller groups and taking their breaks together to ensure that if there is a case of COVID-19, that a smaller group has to isolate itself. Hearing some great stories of companies absolutely insisting that they're going to give their staff full pay if they have to isolate for 14 days. So I think there is a great amount of initiatives going on, and I think it's another example of where the fresh produce industry does really care about its staff and is really, contrary to some people's public opinion, that working in the food production industry or the fruit and veg industry is perhaps not the greatest place to work. I'm hearing some really excellent stories of how companies are trying to look after their staff and make sure that they're treated well in these extremely troubling circumstances. We're going to move on to the topic of getting the most from your workforce. This is not specifically on COVID-19, I suppose, because it is part of a much bigger picture, but it's totally relevant right now because, as many of you are aware, AHDB's work as part of the Smart Hort project has focused on using lean principles and techniques to improve the productivity of businesses, and also, of course, help address some of these labour shortfalls that we have. Gracie, you've been doing a lot of work on that. Can you tell us a bit about that and what sort of advice you'd give to businesses who are worried that the productivity of their workers might not be as good this year?
Yeah, of course. So one of the main focuses for, and lots of you will be aware of this, of Smart Hort has been on getting the most from your workforce. So obviously, whilst no one wanted the challenges of what's happened, it has enabled us to. We actually have quite a lot of resources that we're hoping that we can work with businesses to really make the most of over the coming season. So there's definitely different ways in which we can maximise the productivity of the workforces that businesses do have available. So whether we're looking to upskill workers by using techniques such as Champion, which is something that we worked with Chris Rose to develop, and looking at how we can really motivate the workforce by trying to upskill by using a really, really good example of how to do the job properly, and using that to upskill the rest of the workforce, to embedding lean principles within a business. And by doing so, really removing as many of the processes as possible, which ultimately aren't adding value to the end product. So again, what we've done as part of our response to coronavirus is to pull together a web page called Getting the Most from Your Workforce, where we're signposting to all of the resources that we've been developing over the last few years. So from articles about the Smart Hort centres and some of the key principles of lean, to the Champion videos and articles and interviews about that. It's all populated in one place with signposting links where you can go to find out more about these areas and make sure that we are getting the most out of the workforce that we do have available.
Superb, thank you very much. Okay, we're moving into our last part of the webinar now, and this is your opportunity to put some questions to the panelists. I'm not currently seeing any coming up, so don't be shy. Do put questions or comments that you would like to be discussed or that you would just like to be read out. Do please submit them via the question panel on the right. In the meantime, I'd like to ask the panel a few questions myself. Jack, coming to you first of all, do you think the labour challenge is one that is across the board in horticulture, or is it specific to certain sectors really?
Obviously, I mean, it's much more acute in those crops that are hand harvested, and obviously there's quite a lot of horticultural production which is mechanically harvested. But I think for those sectors that are reliant on labour for their harvest, I think sitting here today, we've got to assume that the labour challenges, are going to carry on, and that a large chunk of the industry could be adversely impacted. As we said right at the start, I think there's a real nervousness about what the future looks like and whether people who are volunteering to take up jobs on the farms at the moment will still be here when we're marching through the season, June, July, August, September. And let's not forget that the fresh produce season runs on pretty much to the end of October, into November, and then we're not far off the Christmas rush. So there is a very, very long way to go. And I think it's entirely understandable and probably realistic that we're all nervous about how this season is going to map out. I think history will show that 2020 is probably going to be one of those seasons we're unlikely to forget in a hurry.
Yeah, that's for sure. Lee, are you noticing particular sectors that are coming to you saying we're really desperate above others?
I think the issues are the same across all sectors. Obviously, some sectors have across the board a bigger requirement. So the soft fruit sector alone accounts for nearly half of the total workforce, and so of course they are particularly concerned about peak season. I mentioned earlier about the potential for UK workers going home and still restrictions on getting EU workers, so that could well hit right at the peak of the soft fruit season, which is a major challenge. But the issues will be felt for all sectors because we don't have sufficient labour from the EU, and we haven't for a number of years. We've had shortages for 3 or 4 years in a row now, and there's concerns about what's going to happen in 2021, and in terms of immigration policy. There's concerns about whether the government will assume, because we managed to get UK workers this year, that actually therefore will be fine for next year too, and they won't give us a pilot, expand the pilot scheme. There's lots of issues, and they will be felt across all sectors. I don't think anybody is particularly confident right now.
No, that's for sure. Question from Beverly Dixon. What are your recommendations regarding testing for those colleagues living on site? Gracie, is that an area that you've looked at?
Going to be honest, I haven't looked into that, I'm afraid, so I wouldn't feel comfortable giving any recommendations on it, but it's certainly one that I'm happy to take away and ask some questions about.
Okay,
Michael,
either Lee or Jack got a comment on that?
Yeah, Michael, let me come in here because I know this was a subject of considerable discussion in a meeting with the Food and Drink Federation this morning. And obviously the testing for key workers was opened up over the weekend, and there were reports of all the slots being taken up. But I think they are very, very keen to open up the mobile testing. Now, I think we ought to recognise that it's only for people who are displaying symptoms or have been in contact with a member of the family who's displaying symptoms. But actually, I think the importance of this, and I suspect that the queues will dissipate as we get into we get further into this. But I think the important point here is that it does give people an option to get workers tested who think they might be displaying symptoms, and then you can make an informed decision one way or the other. I think the concern at the moment is that if somebody, has got a cough, have they got COVID-19? Have they not got COVID-19? Is there any way of telling? And then, a chunk of the business sort of goes into suspension while everybody holds their breath, wondering what's going to happen next. So I think the advent of testing, and as I say, as we get further into it and the system ramps up and it gets able to cope with the numbers, does give growers another option just to better understand what's going on within their business.
Absolutely.
And, I'd like to chip in as well, sorry, Michael, just a super quick one. Obviously, when we're looking at phased exit from lockdown, which may be only a handful of weeks away, we're still waiting to see from government, but it's almost certain that as the government relaxes rules around lockdown, there'll be a greater requirement for testing of workers to give the confidence for businesses to continue to operate or to open up if they're closed down now. So what's really important from a farming point of view and from a food point of view is that we are already a key sector, that our workers do need to be high up on that list for getting tests, so that we don't have any challenges or greater challenges in the food industry going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also about reassurance of the public, and that people that do come to work on farms know that testing is taking place and that they're going to be safe. And that actually brings me to a question I'd like to ask the panel, which is a bit about the public perception story. We heard there were one or two stories about growers being threatened because they were bringing in staff from Eastern Europe, and this is a story that's been around for years, isn't it? There was things in the news about planes coming over with seasonal workers from Romania and locals not liking it. It seems to me that even in the current situation, there's still more of a PR job that we as an industry need to do to explain to the public the value of foreign labour, even though we've got George Eustice getting up yesterday and brilliant that he did and referred to the fruit sector in his COVID-19 press conference yesterday. Do you still think, Jack, that there is a public relations job to be done to explain why we need seasonal labour?
Yeah, I think absolutely, Michael, there is, because in these days of social media, we all go on about how good social media is, but there's a downside to social media, that anybody can go on and say anything, and quite often bad news gains currency much faster than good news. In this day of keyboard warriors, people can hide behind email addresses and say whatever they want, issue death threats. I mean, it's a sort of sad indictment on where we've got to with society. And one might have hoped, with one of the messages around CV19 being "be kind," that people might have refrained a little from this, but apparently not. So I think we certainly here at British Growers have taken every opportunity to go into the press and explain why we are where we are, why these people are important, that actually they provide experience, and they help to support the inexperienced workers that are coming to take on these jobs. They're not taking huge numbers of other people's jobs. The numbers involved at the moment are relatively small, but they're very, very key element of bringing in the harvest. And I think every opportunity we can get to put that story across, we have to take.
Absolutely, and I'm sure, Lee, that's something that the NFU is working hard on as well, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just one thing to say is the people that are coming in from the EU aren't taking anybody's jobs, because they were their jobs. The people that are coming in were already recruited. There is sadly a constant PR requirement to educate consumers on that need. Like I said earlier, 99% of our seasonal workforce are EU nationals, and that's not because that businesses choose to ignore the UK general public. It's just that's how businesses, that's how seasonal work operates globally. Every country around the world has a system of bringing in seasonal workers. Germany just this year, because of the issues around coronavirus, facilitated the industry to bring in 80,000 people over April and May. We're not unique in this regard. one thing I just want to add is I think a particular frustration is not necessarily the need to educate the public, but actually we seem to have to constantly re-educate the government on the requirements on seasonal labour. And this year we're going to have to work again because, as I mentioned previously, there will be a proportion of UK workers on farm. We can't let that be automatically assumed that that's a sustainable long-term solution for the future, because these people will go back to their day job. So as well as educating the consumer, we continually and passionately educate government to make sure that they provide the policy support we have so that we can continue to access workers in future.
Yeah,
I think, Michael, if I can chip in here as well, I think what's interesting is, I've lost count of the number of journalists I've spoken to, but actually when you start to explain to them what's involved in getting fresh produce from the field into the retailers and the need for a little bit of experience, actually they do get exactly why we're doing what we're doing. So, actually the press, once it's explained to them, are generally being quite accepting of the situation.
That's true, and there have been some more positive stories in the last year. It is hilarious. Who was the MP who made some comment about importing all of our food just before the coronavirus crisis, and he couldn't have been proved more wrong, could he? I can't remember who it was, but it's the timing was quite spectacularly bad, and he was proven wrong within weeks and shown just how important the domestic food supply is. We've coming to the end now. If you've got any final questions or points, please do submit them now. I'd like to end on a couple of more positive notes otherwise, and look at the long-term impact of what's happened here. We're obviously, once this crisis is over, we're going to go straight into the next one, which is Brexit, potentially. Is there anything that we can have learned from this crisis that might help us in the Brexit situation? Let's say, God forbid, there's a no-deal Brexit, or I don't know what's going to happen, but is there anything that we've learned from how we've handled this that could help, Lee?
Yeah, so forgive me, I'm going to sort of point towards government again just for a moment. I think what we've learned from this experience, although we've kind of known all along, but it's been very clearly demonstrated, is that there are governments around the world and across Europe that value our industry significantly, in that they put policy measures in place to help ensure that they have a viable horticulture sector going forward. So I mentioned, Germany supporting the access to workers. In the Netherlands, they've created a 600 million euro aid package for the ornamental sector, which has been shut down just like ours. I think it's in terms of lessons learned, it's about trying to ensure that our government sees the value in this sector and recognises the value in this sector. It is, it's 2% of the farmed land, 25% of the output value. It's a large employer. It offers a lot for GDP. It's a skilled sector. It's got increasingly technology. The emphasis on supporting this sector, the emphasis on food security, that's definitely shone a light now, because with supply chains impacted, should we be producing more of our own? So I think, a joined up approach with government to ensure that they see the value and they support this sector, because we need this sector to grow, not to shrink on the back of this.
Definitely. And Jack, how do you see it? What are we taking away from this crisis?
Well, it's interesting that you should mention those comments. I think they came from one of the advisors in number 10, suggesting that agriculture was completely irrelevant. Well, I think the events of the past 5-6 weeks have shown that it's absolutely crucial, that far from being irrelevant, agriculture, is filled with key workers. These are the people who put food on the table, and without food on the table, we look pretty silly. And I hope what this is going to do, and it's interesting that we're going to get back to the agriculture bill when hopefully this we get through this current crisis. It will just reinforce in the minds of politicians just how important it is to have a domestic food capability. And you can't emphasize that enough. We can't just export our food production business to other parts of the world, and then hope that that's going to satisfy the requirement to provide food, for 66 million people, 7 days a week, 52 weeks of the year.
Yeah, definitely. And Gracie, no doubt a lot of the resources that AHDB's been working on in recent weeks actually will serve as examples of best practice going forward, won't they?
Yeah, completely. One of the key things that's come out of this entire situation for me is the importance of having really clear communication and clear, simple processes in place, so that things only have to be communicated once in a clear way, which can be, everyone knows what the expectations are for that day, for that week. When new starters come in, there's a very clear process to follow. And obviously all of the resources that we've pulled together, we've been able to really appreciate the value of having all of these resources in a much more coherent, easy to find package. And so that's definitely something that we'll be building on going forwards as well.
Fabulous. And just final questions just come in from Sarah Fairhurst. We've talked about the government, and she says, do we think we'll have more joined up thinking from the government on a seasonal agricultural workers scheme with a decent quota following on from COVID? I guess that ties in to what we're saying about hoping that this underlines the fact of the government. Anyone like to comment on that? Will we get a more joined up thinking on a SAWS scheme?
Yeah, so sorry, quick comment from me. So we've got a massive challenge in that time is critically short. In fact, arguably we're already past the point of no return, but we haven't yet had a commitment out of government on a seasonal worker expansion for next year. And we know freedom of movement, unless the transition eventually is pushed back, but current government rhetoric suggests not, then freedom of movement will end, and we will end up with just a pilot scheme of 10,000 workers and maybe a small proportion of the UK workers that may be prepared to come back. So will we get the support from government? We absolutely must, because if this industry doesn't have access to workers, unlike every other country, every other developed country in the entire world, we would be unique in not being able to bring people in. Then our industry, it stops. There may be certain parts of the industry that might be able to carry on, but predominantly UK horticulture will stop. So it has to, it absolutely has to. And while this whole situation around coronavirus has been taken, understandably, all of the focus in recent weeks, we are very much picking back up the baton in trying to secure the future for next year as well.
Absolutely, and if they don't support the industry, it just seems to go against everything that they've committed in terms of trying to be carbon neutral, in terms of environmentalism, in terms of everything that they want to do. It all points to that surely common sense has to prevail when it comes to supporting the horticultural industry to do its job. I'm going to call it there because we're just about to touch 8 o'clock. So I'd like to give a huge thanks to Jack, Lee and Gracie for their contributions tonight, and to all of you for joining. I hope you've got some value out of tonight's webinar. The recording will be made available if you wish it to hear it back or to share it with your colleagues. If you've got further questions about the specific resources mentioned here, please do get in touch with the AHDB team on that, who I'm sure will be delighted to help you. And I'd like to thank you again. Please do stay safe and all the best with your businesses. I hope that you can navigate the difficult weeks ahead and keep doing the fantastic job that you're all doing. So thank you and good night.